I'm Sasha Killewald. I'm the director of the Stone Center for Inequality Dynamics. Thanks again for being here. Great to see so many folks here today. There's a sign-up sheet going around. So if we don't already know you and you'd like to receive announcements for talks like this, or if you'd like to come hang out with us during our writing retreats or our early ideas workshops, please sign up and we'll be happy to follow up with you in whatever way you choose. As always, I like to say, no matter your discipline, no matter your method, no matter what type of inequality you study, if you'd like to come hang out with us, you are very welcome to. So whoever you are, we'd be happy to get to know you. One more point of housekeeping before I introduce our speaker. Monica's going to take clarifying questions throughout today, so feel free to do that. We will, of course, reserve some time at the end for a more substantive Q&A. With that in mind, as usual, the mics are on. So your rustling, your chewing, your talking to your neighbor will be picked up by the mics more so than they would be otherwise. All right, with all of that out of the way, it's my pleasure to welcome Monica Prasad. She is Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Economic and Political Sociology at the Johns Hopkins Department of Sociology. As I'm sure many of you know, she's the author of multiple award-winning books on the political economy of the United States, and including in comparative context. In Starving the Beast, she chronicles how tax cuts became a defining policy platform of the Republican Party. In The Land of Too Much, she seeks to explain the U.S.'s distinctively weak social safety net. And in both of these books, she uses archival evidence to really dismantle conventional wisdom about these moments or social facts that we thought we knew. She has received fellowships from Guggenheim, Russell Sage, and Fulbright, and her work has been recognized by multiple sections of ASA, economic sociology, political sociology, comparative historical sociology, and by the ASA itself for the overall best book in sociology. So it's a real honor for us to have Monica with us here today. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you, Sasha, and thank you so much for inviting me here to Michigan. I spent a few years here a quarter century ago, and so it's just been lovely to come back and explore all of this. A few years ago, I wrote a book called Problem Solving Sociology, and as soon as I published it, the entire world went to hell in a handbasket. So nothing really got solved. Nevertheless, I want to point out that I'm not the only one saying that sociology and the social sciences ought to be more oriented towards trying to solve problems. Completely independently from me, several other scholars have made similar arguments. Duncan Watts writes in Nature that social science ought to be more solution-oriented. A few years ago, there was a set of articles in Socius. Adam Gamaran says here, inequality has long been a central focus of sociological research, but some argue that sociology as a discipline has actually done little to reduce inequality in society. We've been spending our time describing it. And so Socius did these set of articles trying to get us to how do we reduce inequality agenda. Recently in economic sociology in Europe, there has been this turn toward what they're calling a positive turn, exploring solutions to the challenges of our time. They use positive in a way that's a little bit odd. We tend to think of positive in terms of like positivism, positive versus normative. They're thinking of it, I think it's coming from positive psychology, you know, resilience and all of that. And so now there's positive sociology, positive economic sociology. And then the SSRC launched a year-long effort to think about research to solve problems. So there's something in the air. There's something suggesting that we need scholarship that is a little different from what we have been doing. And so the reasons for this, I think, are one, the aforesaid, the world is going to hell in a handbasket. It's making everyone wonder what is the role of the scholar in society, in life. I think that's part of what's going on. I think there's an internal dissatisfaction with some of the things that we have been doing. I think that in sociology, there's a dissatisfaction with describing as the only thing we do or labeling things as the only things we do. I think in political science and economics, there's a little bit of dissatisfaction with the methods driving the substantive agenda, rather than trying to explore questions that we think are important for our own purposes. And there are certain innovations in our understanding of how science works that I think are also driving some of this. So this is a fascinating book by Donald Stokes, a political scientist, that argues basically that the division that we think we have between natural sciences and basic or applied sciences is not necessarily as stark as one may think. So he talks about the work of Louis Pasteur, which he says, think about it as a 2x2 in which you have research that is inspired by use, sort of basic and applied research, and research that isn't. And research that is on a quest for fundamental understanding, right? And so he thinks, if you're talking about Niels Bohr, and he's looking at research that's about the fundamental nature of the structure of the atom, that he thinks is research that doesn't think about considerations of use. It's only about trying to understand, right? At the other end, you have Thomas Edison just doing very, very applied kinds of science, right? He is interested in the example of Louis Pasteur, who started with a project that was trying to figure out why beetroot alcohol sours, and ended up developing evidence for the germ theory of disease, right? So applied research that goes in a fundamental direction. Some people say that this quadrant, he didn't have a name for it, but some people call it tinkering, like the Victorian, sort of just not even thinking about applied uses, just kind of trying to, figure out how things are. And so Stokes is interested in this Pasteur's quadrant. And it's gotten attention from a lot of people to the extent that I actually found about Pasteur's quadrant. I think it doesn't actually, you haven't really made it until you get an XKCD cartoon about it. So once we're there, we'll know it's there. But anyway, partly inspired by these various trends in sociology and other disciplines, we have this community, problemsolvingsociology.com, where we do various virtual events mostly, some in-person things. On Friday, we did this panel on teaching with a problem-solving lens. I think we just put the recording up there with Erin McDonald of Notre Dame. It's just really, really interesting. So all of this is going on. And I say that as a prelude to my talk, because one of the criticisms that I get from people who have not read the book, about the book, is that problem solving is only about narrow, small problems. I think there's something about the words that connotes, small and narrow, and so that's what they say. Well, what about the big problems? And so I wanted to go through a problem-solving approach to a big problem, right? The problem of populism in America. Are there any questions right now before I launch into the actual talk about any of this problem-solving framework? I'll be happy to talk to people about it afterwards. But okay, so let's talk about the problem of populism and what it might feel like, what it might look like to try to actually approach it with a solving kind of, right? All right, so it used to be the case until recently that economists understood globalization as not really the main factor to look at in terms of the decline in the manufacturing sector. So they would put up, they would make arguments like this, like if you look at NAFTA, if you look at when China enters the WTO, it's not really causing this major decline. It's just the continuation of a decline that long predates that for reasons of automation, etc. So this used to be the case. They also pointed out that if you look at how much manufacturing employment we've lost, from 1979 to 2023, it's about 4 million jobs. In those same years, we have gained a lot more jobs. So it used to be the case that it was seen, in general, by economists, by the general public, by observers, that globalization was not the main thing to be considered. Starting around 2013, a set of papers came out that I think have really been a game changer. This is the work, of course, of David Bond and David Dorn and their collaborators. And their main point is that although the gains dramatically outweigh the losses have been geographically concentrated, and that is a big issue. So, for example, they say, we find strong evidence that congressional districts exposed to larger increases in import competition disproportionately removed moderate representatives from office in the 2000s. Trade-exposed districts initially in Republican hands became substantially more likely to elect a conservative Republican, while trade-exposed districts initially in Democratic hands become more likely to elect either a liberal Democrat or a conservative Republican. So in our geographically instantiated political democracy, these geographically concentrated job losses do matter. So that's where my talk begins. And the question that I want to ask is, if the gains were so much bigger than the losses, why could we not take some of those gains and give them to the people who lost their jobs? Why couldn't we adjust, right? And it's an interesting question to ask because, of course, we have known all along that we need to do this adjustment with compensation. In the paper that brought free trade thinking into the American Academy, Stolper and Samuelson write, nobody, of course, ever denied that the workers employed in industry which loses a tariff could be hurt in the short run. The harm which free trade inflicts upon one factor of production is necessarily less than the gain to the other. Hence, it is always possible to bribe the suffering factor by subsidy or other redistributive devices so as to leave all factors off as a result of trade. And that's my question. Why didn't or couldn't we bribe the suffering factor, right? And I'm not going to give a full explanation of this question in America. A full story would have to consider questions like, well, what is the difficulty of moving? Is it getting harder to sell your house? Or what about the fact that a lot of the jobs that are being gained are going to women who are coming into the labor force? What are the jobs that are being lost or jobs? So these gender issues. I'm not going to get into all of that. I want to focus right now on the political effort, the legislation around this. The reason I'm focusing on that is because beyond just the historical question, I think there are important lessons that we need to learn from this effort because the China shock may by now have been absorbed, but there are other countries that are also rising, and we're going to see maybe a Southeast Asia shock. So the trade shocks are not over. The green transition is about to happen. So I saw one estimate that said, well, the green transition, you'll lose 2.4 million jobs, but you'll gain 12 million jobs. Of course, if we just, saw that picture, the question is, well, what happens to those 2.4 million, right? And of course, AI. There is this question about what do you do with job losses caused by automation? How might you adjust? This question of adjustment and it gets to this bigger question about, are these kinds of rational policies of compensation possible or not? All right, so I'm studying this question by studying what happened when the US first began to move in this direction and tried to compensate the losers, right? And the story begins with a young senator from Massachusetts. In the 1950s, John F. Kennedy is a senator, and he is very aware of what free trade can do for job losses. So the developing countries start to develop, in most cases, by focusing on textiles that they won't export. This is affecting Kennedy's constituents. So the American textile industry it's already deeply harmed by textile manufacture moving to the south, and then it's just decimated by textile manufacturers coming from Japan. So the last textile mill in Lowell closes in the 19th. So Kennedy is very aware of free trade, the problems of free trade. He is also aware, and the political world in general also remembers Smoot-Hawley, the protectionist legislation that everyone at this point is aware exacerbated the Great Depression. And they are all very, very concerned that they don't want to go back into a protectionist kind of mode. Even the AFL-CIO was pro-free trade at this time. Labor was pro-free trade at this time. So this is really something that the political world in the US agrees on. There are protectionist pockets in Congress, and they are preventing more free trade turn. There are also geopolitical reasons for moving this direction. Here's one quote that says, "Recently, we risked a world war in Korea in order, among other things, not to leave Japan exposed to communist aggression, but we're apparently willing to risk the loss of Japan to the free world in order not to leave American textile mills and garment manufacturers, all of whom hold themselves out to be defenders of free enterprise, exposed to Japanese competition." So geopolitical reasons for moving in free trade direction. There are also specifically concerns about the European Economic Community, which at this time is lowering trade barriers internally. And the US is very concerned that this massive trading bloc is going to be formed, which it is not a part of. So all of these reasons to move in the direction of free trade. Nevertheless, there are these protectionist pockets, right? And so there's a question about what to do. This commission is formed. It's called the Commission on Foreign Economic Policy. This guy in the front is Clarence Randall, the head of the commission. This is President Eisenhower here. And this person here is David McDonald. He's the president of the United States Steelworkers. He is the key person for our purposes because he comes up with this idea of adjustment assistance. So he says what we just saw in that Stober-Samuelson quote: we need to take the gains from trade and compensate those who lose from trade. Right in the 1950s, there is still a little bit of pushback from business on this. This is Prescott Bush, the father of George H.W. Bush. Looks a lot like him. So he's on this commission, and he's not so sure about it. Nevertheless, over the course of the 1950s, business does come on board. Mark Mizrachi told me he couldn't be here today, which is unfortunate because this is the Committee for Economic Development is one of these business groups that he talks about, these moderate pragmatic business groups that he talks about, that is also getting on board. So you have labor on board, you have business on board, you have politicians like Kennedy on board. So this is really a moment of American corporatism. You have Walter Reuther, who is the president of the UAW, literally going to Sweden to see what we could adopt from Sweden. We could have moved in this direction. Over the 1950s, nothing happens because of the kind of protectionist pockets in Congress. Ms. Sanchez points out, she called it selective protectionism. The president and many are more for trade, but there is opposition at congressional level. However, when Kennedy becomes president, he pushes through, he manages to get through the Trade Expansion Act of 1960, which is an act to promote the general welfare, foreign policy, and security of the United States through international trade agreements and through adjustment systems, domestic industry, and labor, and for others. So embedded liberalism of the European kind is actually happening in the US. If you're a scholar of Europe and you read about this stuff in the 1950s, it curls your toes, right? It could actually have gone in this direction. And then how does it all fall apart? So between 1962 and November 1969, the Tariff Commission rejects all petitions for compensation. The Tariff Commission is this independent body that has been given the task of approving or rejecting petitions. It rejects all 26 that are set in this time. The language in the 1962 Act says the Tariff Commission shall promptly make an investigation to determine whether, as a result, in major part of concessions granted under trade agreements, an article is being imported to the US in such increased quantities as to cause or threaten to cause serious injury to the domestic industry producing an article which is like a direct competitor with the imported article. Increased imports shall be considered to cause or threaten to cause serious injury when the Tariff Commission finds that such increased imports have been the major factor in causing or threatening to cause such injury. All of these words become key issues. In major part, serious injury, the major factor. And even such, in one case, becomes this huge deal. American Ceramic Products does a petition. The Tariff Commission finds imports were not the result of trade concessions, but of other things, like the rise in consumer purchasing power, the increase in the number of families in trade and market for higher priced China, et cetera, et cetera. Industrial biochemicals, the Commission finds the imports were not in such increased quantities as to cause serious injury. National Trial and Manufacturing, they say imports are increasing, but not in such quantities. There was no injury to Fisher, but there was injury to Fisher, but not serious injury. The Commission finds that the firm had been harmed by trade in one case, but at the time of filing was no longer being harmed by trade. So all of these reasons, right? And scholars have pointed out that there was this problem that firms were having that if a firm was economically healthy and it could survive the increased imports, then commissioners concluded there had been no serious injury. But if a firm did not survive, the commissioners concluded the firm must have been unhealthy to not be able to survive. And so there must have been other reasons for the firm's failure. So over and over and over again, this is going on. And of course, labor is incredibly upset about this. In the 1970s, labor is turning against free trade. So this is from 1962. The AFL-CIO calls on Congress to enact in 1962 a new trade law, which would maximize opportunities for expanding trade, contain safeguards to ease the impact of change through a trade adjustment mechanism. If American labor is to continue its support for a liberal trade policy, there must be adequate assistance or relief for those adversely affected by increased imports. Labor is on board in 62. In 63, they are happy that this act has been put in place. In 67, after some of the first rejections, they're starting to get a little bit impatient. They're saying the AFL-CIO supported the Trade Extension Act with the understanding that its continued support was based on adequate aid and assistance. And by the mid-1970s, they are completely against this. They have turned in a protectionist direction. They are putting all of their energies behind this bill, the Burke-Hartke bill. That is a protectionist bill. There are other reasons why labor turned against free trade. I can't claim that trade adjustment assistance and what happened by the Tariff Commission was the only reason. I cannot even say it was in major part because of the Tariff Commission, but it definitely was a factor that was turning labor in this direction. Once labor turns against it, business turns against it. The moderate CED, yeah.
Just a clarifying question. What is the trade adjustment? What is the compensation that firms or workers would have received had they been approved?
So at the time, it was something like 65% of your salary you would have received for a certain amount of years. People complain after 69, it was loosened a little bit, and people complained that was not enough. But right now, I'm just interested in why it just never even got ready. So the labor turns against, and then the moderate CED gives way to the much more ideological business roundtable, which is no longer so interested in thinking about trade adjustment assistance because it didn't work in keeping labor away from protectionism. So we had this beautiful moment of perhaps American corporatism. It fell. So why did it fall apart? So one, you might ask, well, was the commission partisan? Were they either on the one hand protectionists trying to destroy this policy, or were they just anti-labor or something like that? And it does not seem that that was the case. It was always a bipartisan commission, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, and the president was the tiebreaker. But the early cases are actually majority cases or sometimes unanimous cases. Also, before 1962, before this legislation, there was a protections legislation in place that the Tariff Commission was also overseeing. And in that case, they often found that harm to domestic industry was caused by trade. And so they claimed that these new rules, this new language, requires us to, if we're a nonpartisan commission, our only mandate is to implement these rules. This language requires us to do so. So then you ask, well, were the rules partisan? Were they implemented in order to make trade adjustment assistance not likely? And so this is the language as it was originally passed by the House. It says the Tariff Commission shall promptly make an investigation to determine whether, as a result of concessions granted under trade agreements, an article is being imported into the U.S. in such increased quantities as causing a serious injury. The Senate amended the language to add the in major part criterion, right? And so the difference is as a result of concessions granted under trade agreements versus as a result in major part of concessions granted under trade agreements. The Senate Finance Committee's explanation of its change is that, I don't know if we have time to go through it all, but basically they are saying we are loosening the language. They're saying that if you have just this original phrase, then it might require you to demonstrate that trade was the only reason for your industry or for your injury. We are loosening the language in this way, right? I won't get into it, but I think in general that is probably what they were trying to do. This is Robert Kerr who pushed through this language. He was neither a protectionist nor a free trader. He does seem to have wanted to do this genuinely. So isn't this one of these messed up contingent things that happen? You know, is this like an absurdist novel? We're trapped in like contingent absurdities. Yeah, I don't think we can exclude the possibility of being trapped in an absurdist novel, but I do think that if contingency is where you land, my own, this is a big philosophical debate we can have in Q&A, I think your analysis isn't broad enough. You need to broaden the scope of it. So I think what's going on is, one, it's a case of something that I've talked about in my prior books, which is the progressive American state gets in the way of progressive policies. So I talked about it in when I also landed too much. That one talks about how progressive tax legislation undermined the growth of the welfare state and other things like that. This has actually become a topic of a big debate, not because of my book, but because of other scholars, including Nicholas Bagley, who is a professor here in the law school, I think. He argues about the procedure fetish the American state has. Others have recently been making this argument that environmental laws get used to prevent environmental construction. You know, so you're trying to build some sort of solar energy factory or whatever, and people weaponize the environmental laws to delay. So in this case, the progressive state is the Tariff Commission. It's this. It's one of these independent, nonpartisan agencies that the U.S. has outside the state that are a result of the progressive era. Of course, the European countries have state bureaucracies too, but they are bureaucracies within the state, within the ministries. So in the US, it makes coherent policy making just much more difficult. The second thing that I think is going on is that I think you could just draw the lesson that targeted assistance just doesn't work, mainly because nobody else tried to do this kind of targeted scheme. There were a few targeted schemes in Europe, but basically Europe does do something like compensation for free trade. And some people argue that that's how you explain the European welfare state. So if you look at trade openness, and if you look at government spending, the countries that are the most open to free trade are the countries that spend the most on social services and things like that. What Europe has done, though, is do these very broad kinds of compensation policies. If you look at this chart, this is spending on active labor market policy. Obviously, the big thing that that stands out is this big COVID jump in the Anglo-American countries, right? A lot of people have been talking about the COVID welfare state and what else. But for me, it's before that really matters. You see that many of the other countries, especially the Scandinavian countries, just spend a lot more on active labor market policy. That the Denmark manifestation of this is that businesses are very free to hire and fire whomever they want. But once you lose your job, the state puts a lot of effort into getting you a new job. So this is active labor market policy. The US is at the very bottom of this. So having learned from the failure of trade adjustment assistance, Obama in 2012 proposed what he called a universal displaced worker program. So it shouldn't matter whether you lost your job to trade or to something else, because that was what was preventing the compensation in the prior case, right? And so Secretary of Labor Hilda Solis says, shouldn't matter whether a layoff is a result of offshoring, downsizing, or business venture. Those who lose a job through no fault of their own should have easy and immediate access to high quality job search assistance, external unemployment system, and sort of reemployment system. It never went anywhere because it fell to the sequester. The lesson I draw from that is that other countries had managed to put universal programs in place before 1973, before the budgetary crisis, before the economic stagflation, depression, etc. And if you miss that moment, it's a lot harder to do this kind of embedded liberalism. So in short, if you try a narrow adjustment program, it's impossible to precisely identify the suffering factor that you need to thrive. If you try a broad program to help all workers, it's too expensive. So I promised you some problem solving, so let's take some lessons from this. The first lesson is beware state capacity, right? So we have this discussion across many disciplines about state capacity. And here, state capacity is actually the villain. It was this non-partisan tariff commission that ruins this moment when we could have gone in a more corporatist direction. The historical lesson to draw, I think, is that trade comes later to the US and administrative statism comes earlier to the US and in other countries. So some of the issues that we are dealing with now in terms of losses of manufacturing, they dealt with much earlier, at a moment when it was possible to spend more on programs of adjustments. And I think a lesson to draw is that when we're thinking about AI, when we're thinking about the green transition, a successful program of compensation in the US today needs to be universal because you can't precisely identify who loses from trade, but it also needs to be incremental. So the gains slowly offset the costs. And I think there could be a window of opportunity for universal incremental programs that help workers. This is basically showing that Republicans have become much more of a worker-oriented party. Their voters are much more likely to be workers than was the case even in the 20s. So perhaps it's possible to do programs like that. I will admit that it seems just ridiculously technocratic to say that the solution is an incremental universal program of worker adjustment assistance, right? But I don't think it's impossible. Apprenticeships, for example, are exactly what I'm talking about. A universal program of worker adjustment assistance So if you lose your job, you can now get an apprenticeship to retrain into a new job. And one of the less noticed facets of recent American political economy is that apprenticeships have really been growing throughout both administrations, administrations. An apprenticeship is where the employer bears the training costs. People who worry about apprenticeships worry that employers don't want to do this because workers will get poached. But when it's really rolled out, that's not really as much of a concern. Because if apprenticeships become industry standard, all employers are paying their share. Poaching also has costs in terms of trying to find the right person. We do not have anything near like the number of apprenticeships, the portion of apprenticeships that other countries do. So there's a lot of scope for growing. There is bipartisan consensus emerging on this issue. So there was a bit of a partisan fight over this over the last decade, just completely subterranean, really. Trump in his first term put together this alternative to registered apprenticeships called industry recognized apprenticeships. Biden completely took those away. Trump in his second term isn't trying to bring them back. He seems to have accepted registered apprenticeships. I can talk more about this if there's interest, but he wants to make them easier for businesses to do. So the details are all going to be in how he tries to make it easier. But I was thinking how all these details, industry, registered apprenticeships, deregulation, et cetera. How do you make this really something that people are interested in? And then I happened to be driving and I turned on the car and the radio was on and this guy was talking. So this is State Senator Cory McCray of Maryland talking about how he got his life together because of an apprenticeship. He was kicking around. He was getting into trouble. He was in juvenile detention before he was even 18. He was in jail. His mother told him, I will keep believing in you until you start believing in yourself, which is a line I like because I feel that my grad student advisors did that for me. But so she was the one who got him into an apprenticeship and he really turned his life around. So if and when this book is published, Senator McCray is the first person I'm going to send it to. So, thank you very much.
I wonder if you can go into more detail about the state capacity issue, because so is it the point that tariff commission, which was ostensibly meant to further the progressive goal, ended up being overrun by like particularistic interests, which then paradoxically like made it harder to accomplish it?
I don't think they were doing this because of particularist interests. I think they were actually a nonpartisan commission that was doing their best to implement the rules. I think that the rules were actually also well-intentioned. And then the words come in, right? Like what does in major part mean? What does serious injury mean? What does such mean? So I think there's, there's a paper to be written here about societies that ground themselves in legal texts. And the fact that texts are, according to some theories, infinitely interpretable, right? And so there's this contingency of the word that's kind of driving you. I think there's a part of that. Yeah, another thing is just, I feel that, I don't know if there are historical sociologists in the room, but I think what the Tariff Commission experienced is what historical sociologists experience, which is the difficulty or perhaps the impossibility of proving causation in one historical instance, right? You can never actually prove causation in one historical instance. And that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to say, is trade really the causal factor or even just the major causal factor in this historical instance? And there was always something that you could say, oh no, it was, it was rising demand. It was rather than this, So I think it was a genuine effort that went awry because you had this neutral technical body of experts trying to manage it separately from the political effort of trying to keep a coalition on board. So.
So you have emphasized the role of state capacity in your explanation and seems to account for what happened in basically the late 60s with this commission. Now, one can think of that may account for what happened exactly in those years, but the policy that you refer to, these universal policies, and my question is, should we think that that's really mostly about state capacity, or the conservative revolution of the 80s with emphasis on, what the market provides is always good, play a much larger role, even when this doesn't say that what you're saying for the 60s, no case, but I'm wondering about the role of state capacity moving forward.
Yeah.
So this thing that didn't happen, how is it explained? It's explained that it didn't happen later, by state capacity or by this,
So I see 1973 as a dividing line. So before 73, it was possible to do more government spending. After 73, you enter this period of economic recession, austerity, et cetera, that is driving, not just conservatives, but everyone to kind of think about what do we do with the state, and that kind of makes it harder to do programs. What does it mean in terms of moving forward? So I wonder if, one of the silver linings of everything happening now, could it be that, we now have both parties open to doing things for workers that we couldn't have done in the last 40 years? I do still think that question about is it too expensive is always going to be weighing on anything we try to do. That's why I'm suggesting that it has to be incremental.
Thanks for this talk, Monica. It was really great. Your answer about causality made me wonder if there's any parallels here with workers' compensation, where this question of causality, responsibility, culpability was fundamental to historical development. That's based on workers' compensation court occurred on the job. I'm sure you've thought about that. I'm sure you've read all about that.
But I will think about
So like John Fabian Witt's book, right, on this, I think it's like all about this sort of question of causality and who's responsible. And this is kind of the central legal debate. And as I think any of us that observe the courts know, if social scientists are thinking about causality, and maybe sometimes sociologists were not that great in thinking about it, historical sociologists have this trouble, man, in the courts, they have a real problem with thinking about causality. And
what is it book?
John Fabian Witt's Accidental Republic. It's a play on words, workplace accidents, and making it's in part of the making of torts.
Yeah.
But it's also a specific case about workers' compensation, so maybe they're parallel.
Yeah, no, I suspect that this question of causation on the courts is probably much bigger than I have gotten to yet. I'm sure that there are people who in the legal scholarship who I should be reading and talking to about it, but yeah, I do think that that's a big piece of it. And then behind it is this question of why is it in the courts in the first place, or why is it in the tariff commission in the first place, which is the piece of it that I'm trying to develop.
Thank you for this talk. I wonder if the policy proposal, that the ideas that you're proposing to solve the problem of American populism go far enough, because you some of these policies that are implemented in a lot of European countries, but in a lot of those European countries, we see the same problems of rising populism, the rise of the AfD, of Marine Le Pen, and so on and so forth, even though they are doing what you're proposing we should be doing. So in a way, could we understand those cases as proving that that is not enough?
European populism is a very different phenomenon than American populism in both causes and shape. So one major thing is that European populism has not, at least yet, taken a protectionist turn. So even Brexit, if you think about one of the reasons that they were arguing for Brexit, they were saying London can become a Singapore on Thames. We want this free trading London. And so it is kind of a puzzle as to why you were seeing this in Europe. And I think this is part of the answer, you know, that isn't really what they're dealing with. But the other thing that I think about when comparing European and American populism is that Europe has had several difficulties that we have not had. So just European unionization is this enormous economic problem. You know, the trying to weld together the German economy and the Greek economy puts on the table all of these difficult issues that we're not even dealing with, right? So there's that. The EU did this kind of self-inflicted injury with moving towards an austerity program at the time that we were doing stimulus, right? So there are these economic reasons why you're seeing populism in Europe that we don't have. The fact that we are still seeing populism suggests to me that the American economic political system is much more fragile than the European one. You know, imagine if we had also been struggling with all of these things and also this huge influx of, you know, migrants from Syria, right? So I think you're absolutely right to notice that there's populism in Europe, and so it just doesn't solve all the populism problems. But I do think this explains why populism here has taken this protectionist turn, which I personally think is going to be much more damaging if it's not addressed.
So another thought that comes to mind as far as the parallels that you're talking about goes back to the very beginning of the presentation, which is looking at something nationally versus looking at something locally. And so, like, one of the things I think of is that the limits of state capacity were that the Tariff Commission was a national organization that was looking at a national level, maybe even if the case in front of them attempted to be more localized, but that what they were looking at was these, you know, limits of causality at the national level when it becomes like the map you had there, right? It's so much more of a causal connection that you're seeing when you look at it in a more local way. So one of the things that, like, working on my own kind of work as far as this goes is the like local version of what do you do when the issues are local, but the only way to fund them are national, right? Which is the issue with workers' compensation, like at times in different like insurance things. Do you do it at the state level versus the national level versus the like municipal level? And I think of that, especially at the apprenticeship question in the applied space, especially is how do you get funding for apprenticeships that are very locally based, but are the only way to fund them has at least traditionally been federally. And now we're dealing with like a capricious federal government that is willing to say, oh, we'll give you this, but then we'll take it away the next day. And so I wonder about like what in that space of kind of, is there like, would it have come out differently historically? And then that the question coming to the present of, are there ways of thinking about it a more local way of kind of gaining political support for things like these, not just at the federal level, but at the state level?
No, it's a fascinating set of questions. I mean, I think part of the issue is individual instances versus the aggregate of cases, right? You know, so you can say in any individual instance, oh, the injury wasn't so serious, oh, the trade concession wasn't the reason. But then, like, if you get, you know, hundreds or thousands of cases where trade concessions are followed by manufacturing decline or followed by, you know, protectionism, it becomes harder to make that case. I do feel that, you know, even in the last 30 years, social science has tried to get further and further and further in terms of causal inference, trying to get closer and closer and closer to causation, right? And I think you can criticize all of it. You can criticize the experimental studies, right? There's this lovely paper that there was this conditional, this has nothing to do with my talk, but just so interesting, this conditional cash transfer scheme in Cairo that they did a randomized controlled study, everything. They found that, oh, if you give women money and ask them to send their kids to school, they send their kids to school. So yay, we figured it out. Jobs done, give women money to send their kids. This sociologist, Heba Gawayed at Boston, she did this ethnographic study she found that what was happening is that women all along had wanted to send their kids to school. You're not changing their preferences with the money, but once they have the money, they're able to pay off corrupt teachers who are asking for money to teach their kids. So if you know that that's the mechanism, your policy is just very, very, very different, right? The policy that you put in place is just going to be very different. So the point is that even the experimental studies aren't really getting at causation, right? So in the legal sphere, they're asking for something that even social scientists cannot really provide, and the philosophers, David Hume says, you can never actually have, there's no such thing as causation, right? But that's what our laws are asking us to give. And so then your real question about federal versus state, that's a really fascinating question. And I think the way that it's currently being weaponized is a difficult thing, so there has been a movement towards federalizing things for decades, but this is really new, so if this becomes a way for the central government to control the states, then all bets are off, no problem solving, really. And I think part of the reason for doing this project is to suggest, well, how do you rein in the populist fervor that allows for that kind of thing? So,
Can you say a word more about why business turned against it? Because as your slide with like the Business Roundtable logo says, there was a lot going on in business politics at the time. And that seems like it might have lessons for the practicality of a solution now.
Yeah, so I haven't actually found any research on this question, and I talked to Mark Mizrachi this morning, and he also doesn't know of any actual research on this question, so I'm going to have to do the archival work on that as well, which I have not done yet. My hypothesis is that, there are a lot of things going on at this time, so it's not just a story about trade adjustment assistance, there's the rise of shareholder value arguments, and so all of this. But this piece of it, I think, is that business is saying, the reason we got on board with adjustment assistance was that it was a promise that it would make labor less protectionist. Labor is now protectionist with this Burke-Hartke bill, so it didn't work. Why are we then going to spend money on this effort? And they just kind of, as far as I know so far, they kind of stop talking about it and then in this much more kind of less pragmatic, much more ideological free trade kind of direction, not even trying to compensate the loser. There's also, I think tax cuts, which I wrote about, do play a huge role here in that becomes the thing that you give to get votes to lead coalition together rather than different kinds of compensation.
Oh, thanks so much. I'm curious, and I love the optimistic outlook in terms of there's somewhat bipartisan approach to compensating labor in some way or the other, and I like the idea of this incremental recompensation. How should we think about incremental revenue in that? Because this has to be financed somehow. And do you see a bipartisan approach to increasing state revenue?
Well, so these active labor market policies, the thing about them is that they should be creating revenue because you're putting people to work, so the cost should be a lot less than it seems, like if you're losing 4 million jobs and then, gaining 80 million, like it should just be a rounding error, right? So the idea is that, well, once you start to do it, the costs will actually be paid for by the program itself. So that's why the incremental piece of it is important. And basically, my main reason for talking about apprenticeship, scientists should be paying a lot more attention to apprenticeships than we are right now, because something very interesting is going on about this in terms of this bipartisan approach. They've doubled in 10 years. There's scope for more growth there. So.
Just a quick question, sort of practically speaking, would be this incremental universal program to compensate like work, imagine like work independent of or as part of the trade agreement that United States have with like Mexico and Canada since the first
I
Trump.
hadn't thought about that, but I would say I'm not independent of that because you know, if it becomes part of the trade agreement, then you get all these questions about, well, was this injury actually caused by the trade agreement or not? You know, so I think the way that European countries have done it is just to have programs that are completely separate from that. You know, for whatever reason you lost your job, we're just going to help you find a new one. You know?
Thanks for the talk. So about the apprenticeship piece, so it's, I think I remember from your slide, there's like 800,000 apprentices in the United States today, something like that. And we're talking about kind of like an incremental approach. I just wonder, like, these numbers are not very high relative to like the total working population in the United States. Like, how do we reconcile like this having a meaningful effect on things we care about, like populism or turning toward more radical politics with like kind of the more practical realities of it would be hard to like 10x this number.
I mean, we're talking about a politics that is on a knife edge, right? You know, 1% of votes in certain districts makes a really huge difference. So even though it's, you know, 0.3% of the labor force in general, it might be, say, 5% of the labor force in a specific place, or 10%, you know. So if the losses are geographically concentrated, the gains are probably also going to be geographically concentrated. So the hypothesis I'm suggesting, the optimistic hypothesis, is that this is a way to compensate the losers that addresses the geographic concentration of job losses. That is the problem that is caused populism in general. Also, I wanted to say that I'm talking about the economic causes of populism. Of course, there are cultural reasons for this. There are, you know, there's technology that is doing all this. But I saw an interesting paper that did a meta-analysis that was basically arguing that if you look at you know, voting shares across countries, et cetera, about 1/3 of the effect seems to come down to economic causes. So I feel that it's really about you know, we're playing at the margins, right? You're never actually going to convince the entire country in one direction, but it's really about addressing these concentrated pockets of job losses.
I just on this apprenticeship point again, I also kind of want to think a little bit more about how you were thinking about what is an apprenticeship and what falls into something like this number. Right? 'Cause I'm thinking about, you know, is graduate training kind of an apprenticeship model? You know, or like maybe it's not even necessarily about the number per se, but if we think about apprenticeship as a model of active labor market policy, are there things that don't count as apprenticeship qua this number, or, you know, as reflected here that maybe is, right? Because the federal government does pay for, I think, all of like medical residents' salary. And that feels like something like an apprenticeship, but it's not, maybe not counted as such. So I'm just curious to get your thoughts a little bit more about what is an apprenticeship. And if we think about that as a labor market policy, what falls into that, and what does that look like, I guess?
So first of all, just on this number, so the United States, with all of its state capacity, does have a very tight definition of what is an apprentice, right? So these are registered apprenticeships. And part of the debate about that is that the Republicans say it's too hard to actually register an apprenticeship, and so we want to deregulate that a little bit. But so this number, you know, it's the employer pays for the training. It has to include on-the-job training, as well as classroom instruction, as well as a credential at the end that is recognized by industry. So that's what a registered apprenticeship is. Labor unions are a little bit worried that if you start deregulating things, then employers will take advantage of apprentices to just give them much lower wages without giving them any of these benefits. Yeah, but so your question was much broader than that, which was just to think sociologically about what is an apprenticeship and what is about. I mean, I also think that the question is about who bears the costs of training. Right, and who bears the costs of retraining? You know, should it be the person themselves? Should it be the employer? Should it be the state? And we, in many cases, have this model where it's the person themselves that bears the cost of the training. And in a lot of cases, it just doesn't make sense. You know, if we need nurses, then why wouldn't you pay for the cost of the training of the nurses? Like, why should they have to bear the costs? But we have this individual model that that you should have to pay for it. For political purposes, I think it's these blue collar manufacturing job losses that need to be invested in other directions. But you know, AI is coming, right? So this whole question about what is work, who pays for the work, who pays for the training is going to be broadly up for debate.
Such a fascinating talk, and my mind is going in so many directions. I think one broad question I have is, what are your thoughts on, is the solution about providing money, or is it about providing jobs?
So yeah, okay, so this is also a big issue. And so at the time, a lot of people pointed out that, well, we can have these great adjustment schemes, but they don't do anything if you don't actually have jobs that people can go in. So the adjustment schemes included things like providing a portion of your salary for a little while until you can find a job. Sometimes they included relocation kinds of money. There was one, so when this debate about trade adjustment was going on, they often pointed to successful adjustment schemes. One very successful adjustment scheme was run by Amtrak, which had this scheme for its workers and included things like relocation assistance, et cetera. I think that all of that works as long as the economy is growing, right? You know, so you help people get into new jobs. When the economy is not growing, then you know, it becomes a problem. But I think the gamble of trade adjustment assistance is that free trade will help your economy to grow, and then you help people get into those jobs that are being created. So it's not about providing the jobs, it's about retraining people to get into new areas.
I'm curious, do you envision any sort of role for like organized labor in any of these solutions? I'm thinking about populism and labor, like times past, right? Early 1900s populism and the role that, you know, militarized labor actions had back then, or like given the current state of how emaciated labor unions are in the US, is it kind of hopeless for imagining going forward? State solutions, organizational solutions.
I mean, there was this like little efflorescence of organizing some years ago, and it didn't really seem to go anywhere, right? I don't know, are there any labor scholars in the room? Yeah, I don't know, I mean, do you want my normative or my positive? It seems to me that labor is not really a big player anymore. It's just the fascinating thing about doing archival research is that you see a time when labor was, you know, like New York Times every year would sit down with George Heaney and do like this major panel, like, you know, 5 reporters would sit down with him and talk and do like multi-page spread about, you know, what do you think and where is labor going, and we're just not in that world. So the technocrats are the best we have.
I think everyone else, thank you again. This is fascinating, and I think probably a lot of what I'm asking builds on what was Robert was asking about thinking more about the role of causality, but especially our rhetoric around causality, and thinking about, you know, one of my takeaways from the presentation is trying to establish very, very strict causality is often what gets us into an issue in the first place, especially when it comes down to, you know, social justice. But then I'm also thinking about that's something now that is increasingly being demanded of social scientists by federal agencies, by the public, of, well, what can you prove? And so I'm curious about how, you know, how we go about in a space that is asking for causality, especially when the really big questions, we probably can't. We may not be able to prove that apprenticeships do work in the ways that we expected or are, and all these things. And so I'm curious about how you navigate that as a researcher yourself.
Yeah, no, that's really the biggest question behind all of this, right? It's the role of expertise in a democracy and what we are demanding of experts or so-called experts. And how, I mean, the story basically is a story about how this demand for expertise fragments this political coalition. And so there is this sort of tension between democracy and science that is, that we've seen in many other contexts as well, and that we've never actually managed to figure out. I guess I'm, although I'm quote unquote scientist and a technocrat, I do think that there is such a thing as too high expectations of science, right? Of these nonpartisan bodies cannot necessarily do what we're demanding of them to do. So I think maybe there's that's the larger question about all of this, I think.
I kind of want to go back to this point on the emphasis on apprentice. So this seems to be like the tension that people are talking about between like vocational training versus like general education.
Yeah.
And do you think that tension is resolvable? And I can sort of see like at least as a lip service that the current administration would, invest more there, not here, right? And so just like purely politically speaking, practically speaking.
That's definitely a huge issue. So Germany has this great apprenticeship system, and we have always resisted moving in that direction. So in Germany, at age I think age 14, you take this exam that determines the rest of your life. And the US has always said, that's not us. We don't want to do this segregation, this kind of caste system. We want everybody to have general education. We want them to go to college. We want them to have second chances and over. And we love these stories, second chances, etc. And the outcomes seem much better in Germany for the working classes. So so this is a real conundrum. Does it mean that we would have to give up our focus on college for all, college for everyone? I mean, a lot of education scholars are saying and thinking. James Rosenbaum thinks that this college for all movement was a mistake. That the outcomes are not actually they're backfiring. Really, they're not as good for the working classes. On the other hand, other people argue that this was that critique is accurate for the last century, basically, but the jobs that are opening up now are actually going to require more college, etc. I mean, I think apprenticeships in this kind of broader way that we're thinking about them don't necessarily have to mean blue collar jobs. There are actually apprenticeships into, say, computer jobs or nursing. So I think it's possible to avoid that big philosophical moral issue about vocational education versus general education, and just have this sort of, let's just steer people into where the jobs actually are.
One final question, picking up on your point about problem-solving sociology, been really interesting, because I think you think about sociology and obviously as a discipline, we're committed to thinking about problems broadly related on inequality, but obviously other things as well. But it sounds like, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Megan, I haven't read the book, so you may address it there, that the point, the kind of the conceit of what you're saying is that there are a lot of problems. We'd like to solve these problems in a deep way, but like we live in a world with really serious political constraints, so that we're not going to be able to necessarily like address the problems on the level and depth that like we're able to describe them. And so like, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, is the conceit kind of that like, we need to think about like the politics of the world and like the situation that we're in order to fashion solutions that are realistic.
So the political constraints can be the problem that you try to solve. So there's always this question of, well, how do you actually, we talk about, okay, well, you figured out the solution, then you talk about the causes of the solutions, right? So that can actually also be, an intellectual kind of thing to do. There's something else you were saying?
No, I mean, that, right, so just the idea of being that, again, problem solving sociology just being something to channel our focus to like addressing problems in a way that is commensurate with the, not just, you have political constraints potentially, or maybe the capacities of science, the capacities of technocrats, like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'm definitely not saying that, if sociologists just turn their attention to solving problems, we'll suddenly solve all the problems. I mean, obviously, there's all this, we would do this in partnership with people outside of sociology, with policymakers, et cetera. But I do want to say that I think we could do more of it than we currently do. And I also want to say that I think it would be more intellectually exciting if we did so.
That seems like a perfect line to end on. So thank you, Monica, and thank you all.